Okay. Thanks, everyone. Again, this is Mike Biggie with Trident Capital. I'd first like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. We have a special guest, Howard Schmidt, with us for a teach-in on the recent cybersecurity executive order that was announced by President Obama last week. We're lucky to have Howard, and I want to thank him for spending the time with us. We look forward to hearing his insider's viewpoint on the order and sort of his thoughts on the impact and what this means for the global IT security market and folks like yourself. We have on the line today all of Trident's cybersecurity portfolio companies, as well as other invited guests and friends of Trident's security practice. So next, I'll quickly walk through the agenda for the call. We'd like to start with a little bit of context prior to diving into the order. I've asked Howard to give some brief history and background over the last 20 years leading up to this executive order. We'll then walk through what the order itself is and what it entails. Then we'll discuss what it means for companies like you, for security practitioners, vendors, et cetera. And finally, we will open it up for Q&A. One logistics note on Q&A: in order to ask a question, you can do it one of two ways. You can either type the question in the question box that's in the bottom right of your screen at any time during the call, and then at the end we can read. I will read those questions. Or at the end of the call, you can click the virtual raise your hand button if you have a question, and we can give you speaking access that way. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Howard Schmidt. We're extremely grateful to Howard, again, for sharing some of his time with us today to get this inside perspective. Many of you, if not all of you, know Howard and his long history of service to the security interagency policy development, implementation, and coordinated engagement with federal, state, local, international, and private sector cybersecurity partners. Prior to his appointments, Howard was, we were lucky to have Howard here at Trident as a venture consultant with us on cybersecurity. Howard was very active board member with many of our Trident security portfolio companies, and it's good to spend time with Howard again now that he's returned to the private life. Previously, Howard, prior to his appointments, was president and CEO of the International Security Forum, ISF. Before ISF, he served as CISO and Chief Security Strategist for eBay, also Chief Strategy Officer for Microsoft. Prior to Microsoft, he was Chief Security Strategist for U.S. CERT, the Partners Program for DHS. He also has more than 26 years of military service, beginning with active duty in the Air Force, later Arizona Air National Guard. When he was with the Air Force, he served as Supervisory Special Agent with the OSI. And then finally finished his last 12 years as an Army Reserve Special Agent with CID, the Criminal Investigation Division Computer Crime Unit. So with that, I'll turn it over to Howard to dig into the executive order.
Thanks everybody for coming to this today, and also Mike and our colleagues at Trident, thanks for sponsoring this. Just want to sort of do a little bit of lay down as far as how we got to where we are today on these things. One is, for those of you watching the slides, in 1996, after Jeff Clark, who was the president, to talk to President Clinton and said, listen, I have a sense that there's information technology sort of running everything these days. Not quite sure we really understand it, not quite sure we understand, what the government's role is. So at that time, President was then known as the President's Commission for Critical Infrastructure Protection, or the CIP. About a year later, General Tom Marsh led that, put a report forth to the President, which effectively said, with all the dozens and hundreds of pages of government reports, said three things. One, indeed, the concern is very valid that IT runs virtually every portion of our critical infrastructure at that point. Bear in mind that that was almost 16 years ago. And two, that the government really is not quite sure what to do or how to do it. And because three, that about 80 to 85% of what we call critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. Caused him in May of 1998 during a commencement address at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. He issued PDD 63, Presidential Decision Directive number 63, that once again on those three areas, one, identified each department and agency within the government that a direct relationship with critical infrastructure to set up a sector-specific line of business in there. For example, Department of Energy with gas and energy companies, Treasury with finance and insurance companies, commerce with the ICT environment, and on and on and on and on. That sort of percolated along. Oh, by the way, the other thing in that order was asking private sector to organize amongst themselves and create ISACs, Information Sharing Analysis Centers. The financial services was the first one that stood up their ISAC. We set up the second one late 1999, early 2000 for the IT sector. And since then, pretty much every critical infrastructure has an ISAC, Information Sharing Analysis Center. Of course, then, and many people have forgotten about it, but a week after September 11th of 2001, we got hit globally by an intrusion, or actually a piece of malware called NIMDA, which is admin spelled backwards. And to this day, has not been resolved where that came from. That really triggered, even though a lot of the emphasis was on the physical world and kinetic, for President Bush to sign an executive order creating the President's Critical Infrastructure Protection Board, or the PCIPB. I was the vice chair until Dick's retirement in January of 2003. And later in 2002, we released the first draft of the President's National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace. I have this down because it's fairly interesting that this was sort of a watershed event, because we started to use the White House website, but it was basically launched at Stanford and asking for public comment, since the vast majority of the owners and operators. We get a tremendous response on that. February 2003, actually Valentine's Day, President issued a National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace. And a shameless plug, Tom Ridge and I released that on Valentine's Day of 2003. He and I are doing a sort of a town hall meeting at RSA on the 28th of this month around noontime, sort of looking back for the 10 years since we issued that, and sort of a backward look at that. 2006, that we created the Classified Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, known as the CNCI. The key word on this, I'll touch on this in a few moments, was the fact it was classified. So therefore, it was difficult for the owners and operators, most of us on the call, to really know not only what it was, but what we could do to help out on it. 2009, President Obama announced the creation of a specific office within the White House, dual-headed between the National Economic Council and the National Security Council, which was a bit of divergent from previous efforts within the White House, who were focused 100% on national security. There was a great realization that the economic piece of that was vitally important as well. February 2010, at the RSA conference, I released a classified version, or early, most of it was unclassified, of the CNCI, effectively using that as a call to action. Then a couple other things that occurred in 2011, issued the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or the NSTAC, the International Strategy for Cyberspace, which was the call to action internationally. And the thing that really leads most to the path of this executive order is Congress had asked the White House to give them some proposed legislation. When I was appointed, there were about 20 some odd proposed pieces of legislation across an equal number of committees, which in some cases were helpful, some cases didn't do anything at all, other cases were conflicting, and other cases would have made it more difficult. So next slide, please. So what does the EO do? And basically the Section 1, which the policy talks about why this is important. First, we've seen, and of course it's been on every news show that I've watched for the past week or so, repeated cyber intrusions, not just in theft of intellectual property and credit card fraud and identity theft as we see generally, but also intrusions into critical infrastructure, which is even more worrisome. We also see that the threat continues to grow, and by all accounts, the President said it first in May of 2009, represents the most serious national security challenge that we have to deal with today. And then, of course, laying sort of down the necessity that it is the policy of the United States, as well as I know a number of colleagues internationally, feel the need to enhance not only security but the resilience of our national critical infrastructures. Next slide, please. So the second piece, and once again, as with any document, you would need a definitional piece and a whole piece of identifying what critical infrastructure is about, not electrical grid, not just the financial services, but really trying to hone down on, it may not be a whole sector, it may not be a specific company, it may not be a certain technology, but trying to identify those things that would have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, as well as public health and safety. The other things that we see, retail, financial services, power, these play into it, and that's the part that's trying to get to is not everything is covered, but yet on the same. There's some pieces that people wouldn't normally think of. For example, the retail piece that would actually fall into critical infrastructure. But it's, excuse me, it specifically carves out IT products and services from the definition, because that's one of the things that, you know, it's not about creating an EO that then calls for a specific technology, which is outdated 6 months later, as we see with technology. Next slide, please. So some of the components and the big ticket items, if you would, was the increased information sharing. And not only myself, towards the White House, but many others in industry have said we really need the government to share more information. We've made a tremendous number of strides in information security / cybersecurity over the past 15, 20 years. You know, we have, you know, security companies like many on this call. We have technology that really gives us better visibility. And I'm very happy to say that for the most part, companies have risen to the call about doing more, not only in protecting their data, but also developing products and services that help foster that. We're far from perfect, and I think we all know that, which is why many of us are on the call today. But we always recognize that there's a chunk of this that the government has some unique visibility into, and that's specifically on intelligence and law enforcement pieces of it that oftentimes are classified or identified as law enforcement sensitive, which in many cases we believe could, A, help better prevent something from taking place in critical infrastructure and in private sector, but just as importantly, if indeed something has taken place, we go back and look for it and probably mitigate the damage or at least reduce the impact, not only immediately but also in the future. So what it's looking to do is federal agencies to share unclassified reports in a timely manner, but also enhances some of what they call the Enhanced Cybersecurity Services, formerly known as the Defense Industrial Base pilot program, looking to make sure that signatures and notices that the government would have visibility and the companies that are interested that have the infrastructure in place. They're just looking to do a better job about so it's a big plus working with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, to really help develop cybersecurity framework. And this is not to say that a new standard is going to be created, because we have ISOs out there, we have NIST 800 series, we have a lot of guidelines. But what are the things that basically would give private sector companies, owners, and operators the ability to tell the government that basically we're doing all that we can do under current technology and best practices to reduce the likelihood of us not working one day? It's indeed specifically directed to NIST and DHS to work with the owners and operators, so this becomes a mutual effort, not something the government tries to come in and dictate. But also, as I mentioned a moment ago, look at the existing international standards, practices, certifications that are out there. And then basically, as I mentioned in sort of the first piece of this, is making sure that the framework is technology neutral, because as technology moves so fast, they can't be creating some sort of a framework that has to be changed every 3 months. And like anything, if it needed to be changed in 3 months, it would take 6 months to do it, and it's already outdated. Next slide, please. And some of the additional things in there is once again, not mandating this the framework, but actually looking for voluntary adoption of it, and looking through some incentive, and that's got to be worked out. That's part of the directive, is to say, what are the things that would really motivate people? As I've said many times, both publicly and inside the government, that there's a pretty big incentive out there for companies to begin with. There's a business imperative. I've never seen a power company get paid when that meter's not spinning, or the smart meters that the digits aren't rotating in there. So as a consequence, there's a real business imperative to do it. It may not be the thing on the highest priority list. There may be budget issues, but the bottom line is there's an incentive. So government and DHS and this is looking to sort of enhance that. Another piece of it is specifically around privacy and civil liberties. And I know there's been some proposed legislation that people have talked about in the past that really got some people concerned, particularly those of us that are concerned about privacy and civil liberties and freedom of speech. So this specifically requires the agencies to incorporate not only the existing, but also look for enhancements, but also to make sure that the safeguards are built in on the existing Fair Information Practice Principles, or FIPS as we know it as. Also, the other thing that was concerning, when you look at the independent regulatory bodies, and for those who aren't familiar with them, these are bodies like SEC, FTC, FCC, FERC, that have congressional responsibility that really are not controlled by the executive branch. They exist as part of it, but they basically create their rules, and they do their notice of proposed rulemaking, et cetera. It's a separate process. But to determine through the existing regulatory bodies what authorities they have to establish any mandatory standards that they need to have in there, but also to make sure they're not being duplicative, that indeed they're looking across the various independent bodies and say, if SEC says this and it's sufficient, we're not going to go out and say something that's layer on top of that that's going to create an unusual burden for private sector. And the last thing, and this is something that falls in the category many of us have been using for years, and that's the power of procurement. It instructs GSA, the Department of Defense, to look at the existing cybersecurity standards and make sure they're built into the acquisition process. So when the government's buying services are good and find out, 2 years later that the company's been intruded upon, want to have that taken care of on the front end. It's built into the contract, how to prevent it, how to report it, and what all the responsibilities going back and forth. Next slide, please. And so, as mentioned on the top end, and Mike brought up that a number of the folks in the call are Trident cybersecurity portfolio companies. A number of them I've had the pleasure of working with over the years, or as Mike mentioned, on the board of. And so there's a lot of things that are being done, as I said a few moments ago, to really answer the call. And it's sort of one of those things that inside the Beltway we have to have good conversations about, because here's a really important need. The entrepreneurship and innovation of private sector comes to the call and helps solve some of these problems, but it also creates jobs, and so it's a really good cycle to get into, and this is an example of some of the folks that are really working on that. Next slide, please, Mike. So I want to take a moment, and any of us that went through business school are probably familiar with the old SWOT analysis. And we've taken a shot at this and tried to, in a very abbreviated way, show what some of the strengths and using that SWOT analysis. A couple of the biggest ones, of course, are the critical infrastructure owners and operators actually are now going to be getting threat information to better protect themselves, including classified information. They have to work on a way to do that so they don't violate federal law and other intelligence rules that are out there, but that is a priority. The other piece of it is to make sure that they're embedding the security practices across all the government pieces. And it's been said for years, and though I think many said that we've not done a good job in doing so, is government has got to lead by example. The very systems that government depends on have to be as secure as well. That also includes the contractors who provide those services for the government. Weaknesses, question many people ask is, why would people do this? It's some overhead, not really the incentives are there, there's no real teeth to enforce it, but that's one of the issues we talk about regularly. Basically, how technical this framework is going to be. Is it going to be sort of like an audit type situation, or is it going to be actual technical controls like we see in some of the NIST things? That's something we don't know about out there. And then one of the things that some have done and some have not, and that's that issue about companies sharing back information with the government. Back in 2003, we changed the Freedom of Information Act laws that gave companies better top cover on sharing threats, vulnerabilities, and with the government to keep it from being disclosed, which may affect their competitiveness in the industry. It's available to the media. And so how exactly does that work, and can companies now do more in sharing that information? I think opportunities, clearly we'll talk about these, what it means to those on the phone. There's probably going to be a fair amount of pressure on the owners and operators to actually do more to increase cybersecurity. It has to be done within the bounds of good business practices. It's got to be done within an economically viable function. The bottom line is there'll probably be more pressure. Some of the sector-specific agencies, although the executive order asks them to do more, there's always the possibility, acting independently, they may decide that they need more regulations, and that's may require then the companies that are on the call and others out there that have an opportunity there to actually go in and solve some of these problems, as well as the new public-private partnerships. Work. And the threats, of course, notwithstanding all the adversaries that are out there, but it's going to only be effective as the framework that we develop on this, and that's where it's really important to make sure that those of us that are on the call as well as others are at the table to say what really will work, what are the practical steps we can make, making sure that we really focus on privacy and civil liberties, because if it undermines that, much of the work we're going to do is for naught anyway. And then basically make sure that, as I mentioned a couple times, we don't get into a box where technology advancing so fast that the framework that's developed is just outmoded from the gate. Next slide, please. So kind of what does this mean to all of you? And I think this is the meat of what this call is about. We see momentum continuing to build, not only in Washington, D.C., but I was over meeting with some of the folks in the EU recently, some of the other European countries, as well as Asia. And every time something happens, there's this momentum building up that we need to do more. We need to get better engaged. The second thing, and it's the fact of national priority. It's good for business. It's good for public safety and national security. We need to do more. The idea of better sharing for information is really going to be key to this, because those things that are taking place that we just basically don't see it coming, we can knock a lot of those back, which makes security services more valuable to the potential victims, and in some cases the current victims. It'll take some time to work. The preliminary version is due in 240 days, which by all accounts, that's more working closer to internet speed than government speed. The President's very serious about this. The final version is due in a year. Hopefully we don't stop doing things in that year. We continue to move forward, but this is some of the deadlines in there. The other thing is that legislation is still looming out there. I know spent a lot of time working on the first proposal and all the various iterations of it, trying to get Congress together, not only in a bipartisan matter, but also a bicameral method, so we can actually bring some of these pieces together to continue to make cybersecurity, information security a forefront of a lot of the things we do. Next slide, please. So this is the part that where we open it up for Q&A. I hope what we've done so far not only gives you a good perspective on the history, some insights to pulling out the key parts of the executive order that the President released. This is also an opportunity for me to say I know the folks that worked on it within the White House, the departments and agencies, and I can assure you that these are really hardworking, dedicated people that put a lot of effort into making this. It's not done just, some four people getting together and sitting down overnight. This was done as a stopgap measure because we couldn't get Congress to move in the direction that I think many of us in the industry and within the government felt they needed to. And I think in my own personal editorial, I've said many times, none of us want to be in a position that something dramatic takes place and then be on the chopping block for the hearings that are going to take place is, why didn't you do more? Why didn't you take some action? So the men and women across the military, the civilian agencies, and the U.S. government that worked on this to try to get it to where it was as business friendly as possible, that really makes some gives opportunities to make some great strides moving forward. I really salute them because it was not easy. It will not be easy, but I just want to put that out there before we got into the Q&A. So, Mike, back over to you, and we'll open it up for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Howard. We do have a couple questions from the peanut gallery here, so I will read some of these that have come in during the call. Okay, from Wayne. As you speak to standards and certifications, can you discuss which ones are imperative, such as common criteria and the certificate of net worthiness? Some of the leading edge organizations may not have these. Will this rule them out?
Interesting. The common criteria is something that we've really lamented for a long time, because not only is it tremendously expensive, but it's tremendously slow. So I think some of the things that have been discussed is how can we use digital identities, for example, not just individuals, but also machine validation authentication, which currently doesn't exist. The second piece of that is looking at areas of continuous monitoring. Today's rock-solid secure system by today's standards can tomorrow be wide open due to a vulnerability, a zero-day that's just discovered. So how do we do the continuous monitoring to be able to identify and remediate those things right away? The other piece of it is, and this is sort of the soft piece of this, is what are the awareness things? I mean, you read some of the reports that have come out. We talk an awful lot about APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, and yet a lot of us, when we sit in rooms together, we say, persistent, yes. A threat, yes. Advanced, no. You know, we're looking at some of the basic components of hacking 101, social engineering, chunks of malware that are dropped out there disguised as something else, looking for known vulnerabilities that haven't been fixed, escalating privilege, taking over systems, exfiltrating data. I mean, this is pretty much the way things go regularly. So when you look at that awareness piece of it, it not only goes from the end user, but also the IT folks, tremendously important. And we've said this dozens of times, if not more, inside the government. We've said it for years outside. About 85, maybe even 90% of the successful intrusions into systems could be prevented just by doing good vulnerability management, identifying known vulnerabilities that have existed and remediating those. So as a consequence, those are sort of the big pieces of that. The other piece of that framework would be you take those big ticket items that I've described and then turn those into how do we let people know that this is the way we're doing business. Not only the government that's with sort of monitoring with exposures, but also our customers, our competitors know that, yeah, it's a priority for us. So when you bring those all together and you look at encryption, you look at all the other pieces of it, that's the framework we're looking to get at that I think really will make a difference in the future.
Okay, next, a softball here. What are the implications of the executive order related to the state-sponsored APTs, such as sort of the recent revelations from China? And you know, as everyone knows, probably on the call, the recent link of China's People's Liberation Army to the massive 140 companies breached Unit 61398 that's apparently located outside of Shanghai. How does this how can you comment on those?
Well, DEO looks pretty generically as far as where the threat's coming from. So while the EO would cover the example you just mentioned, we've seen revelations that the Twitter, the Apple, the Facebook, a lot of the things that not only have we seen most recently, but many of us know have been happening for a long time, are sort of attributed to folks in Eastern Europe, figuring out, yes, only identity theft, credit card fraud gets us so far. Maybe we can start stealing intellectual property, make money that way. So while the EO is open as far as what the threat would come, where the threat would come from, it really looks to make the point that if we build a system that's more resilient, no matter where the threat comes from, they'll be less successful. If they're less successful, none of us think for a moment that they'll stop. What will happen, though, they'll have to start expending more resources, more time, more effort, and in some cases, we reduce the noise and then can really focus on the bad actors. The executive order will help deal with some of those pieces of there. Specifically, when it looks to the recent reports, and I'll speak specifically to China since that's in the news all the time, this is a very, very complicated situation. I mean, for years, when I was in the government, talked about we need to do more. First, it's not as if you can pick up the phone and call the cyber coordinator for the PRC and say, hey, we need to talk because this is getting out of hand, because that doesn't exist. The second thing, like anything in diplomacy that many of us that are not involved in that, this is a very complicated situation. We have trade issues. We have relationships that we need to keep people from building nuclear weapons. There's a whole lot of moving parts to, picking up the phone and saying, hey, knock it off. This is getting out of hand. And those equities are not easily overcome by saying, cybersecurity is more important than anything else, because while it's vitally important to national and international interests, when you look at some of the other things, that's a pretty delicate dance that we have to do. So the core piece of the EO, of course, is focusing on the ability to reduce the ability of any threat from actually having a negative impact on our infrastructure.
Great. Let me play devil's advocate a little bit. This is the first step, as we've said. In order to do it right, doesn't this have to be law, legislation? And so with that said, how does this affect the CISPA bill that's sort of stuck in Congress that does have bidirectional information sharing, for instance, and in some view is having, much more teeth and sort of broader coverage? Will it backfire and actually temper the sense of urgency since something has been done, or how do you see it affecting legislation?
Yeah, first on CISPA specifically relative to the EO is only one way. It's the White House telling the executive branch, here's what you have to do. It has no authority over private sector other than sort of the contract relationship. So when you look at what Chairman Rogers, Mike McCall, and Jim Langevin and those on the House side working on CISPA, I don't think their interest in this will be tempered by the President saying, on the executive branch, you go do this, because they fully recognize there's that private sector component that is not touched by the executive order as far as a mandate. So a legislative slate that says, not only do we give you the opportunity, but we also give you the legal relief to do that. There's a lot of discussion when I was there about I think it's a 1940 some odd law that actually precludes the government from sharing information with private sector and non-cleared people. So that legislation would have to deal with some of that. The other piece of it, I think the executive order does indeed set a really good tone for containment in the proposed legislation that the folks up there are working on, to say, make sure that you include the key principles when it comes to privacy and civil liberties, because that's a vital component of this, because if not, we undermine everything we stand for anyway. So I think the emphasis will still be there. Overall, from a cybersecurity legislation perspective, I think many of us share the concern that some of the key proponents have retired or moved on. There's always a concern when you have a new Congress getting new members up to speed. I think, and rightly so, none of them want to go into a vote the next day not having all the facts. So there'll be some time delay and fact-finding, but hopefully it'll be accelerated, and hopefully it'll be done in a manner which really supports a lot of the core principles that benefit all of us.
Dovetailing on that question, I've got a follow-up from Michael Brown from NeoHapsis. If we're honest with ourselves, how long will it take for the EO to have a real impact on InfoSec best practice in government and private sector?
Yeah, and that's the key issue. When you look at the report being done in a year, and then by the time everybody analyzes and starts moving from there, I mean, it's a very, very absolute best case. And once again, not even factoring into the budget issues and sequestration and all the deficit reduction that we're looking at. At the very minimum, we're probably talking 2 years before we see any credible changes. But that's why I brought up earlier that while this is moving the ball forward, we can't look at this as sort of the be-all, end-all, the silver bullet. We still need to continue to work at internet speed to deal with some of these things. So good question, Mike, and I know you guys are in a position to help move these things forward quickly.
Can you comment on the importance of monitoring, auditing, relative to the security of critical infrastructure?
Yeah, vitally critical, and that's the whole issue that when we talked earlier about continuous monitoring, and even when I was there, we had signed a couple directives in the White House for the agencies specifically around continuous monitoring. The whole concept of sort of doing an annual audit that sort of gives you a snapshot in time of where you are, and any one of us that have been through that, you scurry around leading up to the beginning of the audit. For 90 days after the audit's over, you run around trying to remediate things, answer reports, get things done, whether it's relative to Sarbanes-Oxley or Graham-Leach-Bliley or whatever it may be. Then you go back to business as usual and things slip. Continuous monitoring and vulnerability management and assessment on a real-time / near real-time basis, I think that's a key secret to a lot of these things, really reducing the vulnerabilities. That means the threats are going to be less successful.
Okay. I've got a couple more questions coming in. How does the federal budget tightening and this recent report on sequestration affect the momentum that is cybersecurity in D.C., that the executive order has helped build?
Yeah, there's likely to be some hits, and I think there's nobody shy about saying that, particularly in looks like there's a concern about the defense taking a really, really big hit. So as a consequence, some of the cyber-related things are going to be under intense scrutiny. On the same token, with the emphasis put on it and some of the work being done, particularly with the Department of Homeland Security, NIST, and Commerce, I think they're going to come through it in a much better position. Once again, going back to my earlier comment, nobody wants to be on the back end of a bad incident taking place and said, well, why didn't you do more? And someone raised their hand and said, we didn't have the money to do it. So I think it'll be a mixed bag. Some segments of it will suffer. Others will be enhanced by it. And I think it's all up to all of us in private sector working with our government colleagues to help them better prioritize what needs to be done. And I think that's going to deal with issues around sequestration and severe budget cuts.
Last question: how, as a security vendor, how can we get involved to help develop this, quote unquote, cybersecurity framework for critical infrastructure?
Yeah, I think there's a really important role, and I have no personal visibility into it, although I do understand Donna Dobson, who runs the Computer Security Division at NIST, is going to be at RSA next week. She might have a better insight, as well as Pat Gallagher, the director of NIST. But knowing how they work, what they will do is they will try to convene a working group with private sector to try to help flush this out and do it. The concern always is you get 200 people in there, you get nowhere. You get 10 people in there, and you may not get full visibility. And I have confidence in Donna and Pat and those that work up there. They will try and find a good balance to make sure it's a workable size group that can really make progress, but also has great reach back to the experts that are on the call now to make sure their input is put in there so we can all benefit from it. I would imagine the way this normally does business, there'll be an announcement, there'll be a requests for people that are willing to help work on this. So I think paying a lot of attention on what NIST is coming out with, as well as the folks at DHS will give better visibility as how you can participate, whether it's directly or indirectly through some other party.
Okay. Thanks. Any other questions? If so, feel free to raise your hand. Or type quickly, but I think we can conclude there. But Howard, this has been very helpful. Appreciate your time. Thank you for volunteering to educate us. For everyone on the call, we'll send around an archive link to the webinar. If you'd like to share the session with anyone else, feel free. And thanks again. And I guess we'll see everyone next week at RSA. Howard, any other departing comments?
Yeah, just thanks to you, Mike, and Will, and the folks at Trident for doing this, and thank all of you for the leadership you've been doing, not only with your present companies, but I saw a number of the names flagging across the screen as you were logging in, and recognize a number of those that have really helped get us to where we are today, and clearly would help get us to the future. So I look forward to seeing you all next week at RSA that are going to be there, and appreciate your time this afternoon. Take care.